You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together. Everything.
Brooke Shields in Holy Terror. Alice was too old to play with dolls and too young to make love. Brooke Shields, as you've never seen her before. She was too beautiful to play with boys and too young to play with men. So Alice began to play with death.
Hello, everyone. I'm Annie Rose Malamet, and you're listening to the first episode of Girls, Guts, and Giallo. We are going to be talking about the 1976 film Alice, Sweet Alice. The audio you heard there was from the trailer back when the film was remarketed and re-released in 1981 under the title Holy Terror, which was marketed because of the popularity of Shields after her performance in Louis Malle's Pretty Baby from 1978, in which Brooke Shields plays a child sex worker. And we will probably talk about that film at some point. So I chose Alice, Sweet Alice as the first film I want to discuss because I remember very specifically when this film was on Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments back in the day. I think that show might have been on in the mid-2000s, like I want to say 2005, 2006-ish, and they would always play it around Halloween, and it was a countdown show of obviously the 100 Scariest Movie Moments. So Alice, Sweet Alice was directed by Alfred Sole, and it was written by Rosemary Ritvo and Alfred Sole. It was inspired by Nicholas Roeg's thriller Don't Look Now. At the time, Sole had been working as an architect restoring historic buildings in his hometown of Paterson, New Jersey, and several properties he had worked on were used as shooting locations in the film, and filming took place throughout the summer of 1975 on location in Paterson, New Jersey, where the film is actually set. While this film was not prosecuted for obscenity, the film was seized and confiscated in the UK under Section 3 of the Obscene Publications Act in 1959 during the Video Nasty Panic. There's a great documentary on Shudder about the Video Nasty Panic in the UK, in which many horror films and erotic films were banned or censored. But in the years since its release, the film has accrued a cult following, and it's considered a classic of the slasher subgenre in critical circles. Prior to writing and directing Alice, Sweet Alice, Sole had directed his debut feature, which was an adult film titled Deep Sleep, so a porn, in 1972. The release of the film resulted in obscenity charges being brought against Sole in the state of New Jersey, as well as a formal excommunication from the Roman Catholic Diocese of Paterson, New Jersey. This event has been largely credited as influential to the apparent anti-religious sentiment of Alice, Sweet Alice. When Sole and Ritvo were developing the character of Alice, they wanted to create a child who has been neglected and who could go either way, dividing the audience in regards to her guilt or innocence in the crimes committed. Sole chose to set the film in 1960s era Paterson, New Jersey, which is his hometown, and much of the family drama and dynamics are actually pulled from his own Italian Catholic upbringing. The character of Mrs. Tredoni was based on a woman who lived at the Catholic rectory next door to his grandmother's house and looked after the clergy. Sole was an inexperienced filmmaker when he made Alice, Sweet Alice. Brooke Shields was first to be cast in the film after auditioning in New York City for it in 1975. Sole had seen her modeling in a Vogue advertisement and contacted her mother about the film, expressing his interest in her playing the role of young Karen. Sole cast Paula Shepherd, then a college student in the film, as 12-year-old Alice, so she's actually much older, which I think sort of lends to the ambiguity of her character and if she is guilty or not. She looks much older than she is, which is an old adage I think that a lot of young women can relate to, of developing very early and then being told that you look a lot older than you are. Shepherd was actually 19 years old, and she was discovered by Sole working as a dancer in a local university stage production. Linda Miller, an actress and the daughter of Jackie Gleason, was cast in the role of Alice and Karen's mother, Catherine. And actually, at one point, the production was temporarily halted after Linda Miller attempted suicide. Allied Artists purchased the film for North American distribution and forced the filmmakers to change the title from Communion to Alice, Sweet Alice, out of fear that the public would perceive it to be a Christian film. Allied Artists revised the title, Alice, Sweet Alice, originated from a quote in Volume 16 of the Publications of the Catholic Truth Society, published in 1898. The quote where the title comes from reads, "Then there is Alice, sweet Alice, your eldest born, who leans over the back of your chair and sweeps your face with her brown curls." Apparently, Sole did not like the title change, but in the end, he lost out on that. And Alice, Sweet Alice is how the film is known. The plot centers around the murder in the film, but it also examines the family's self-destruction, and the filmmakers construct a running commentary on Catholicism and the family structure. So now that we have some background on Alice, Sweet Alice, I want to get right into talking about the plot and sort of analyzing some of what I believe to be undercurrents of themes about not only Catholicism and family dynamics, but also the relationship between femininity and repression in the Catholic Church. The film opens with a girl frantically reciting a prayer with a communion veil and a cross, which will eventually turn into a knife that she's holding. So the film opens in Paterson, New Jersey, with single mother Catherine Spages. She's visiting with Father Tom, a priest at the church that she attends with her daughters. And she is accompanied by 9-year-old Karen, played by Brooke Shields, and 12-year-old Alice, played by Shepherd, who both attend St. Michael's Parish Girls' School. Karen is preparing for her first communion, and Father Tom gives her his mother's crucifix as a gift. So this already sets up the competition between Alice and Karen, who are kind of subtly pitted against each other right away in the beginning of the film, with Father Tom giving his mother's crucifix to Karen instead of Alice. A jealous Alice, she then puts on this translucent mask, frightening Father Tom's housekeeper, Mrs. Tredoni. That will become very important, this mask. The mask looks like it's one of those translucent masks that has makeup on it. So when the wearer puts it on, it gives this very scary kind of inhuman effect where the makeup is transposed onto the wearer's face, but that is never really what it looks like. It always looks very creepy. Alice then steals Karen's porcelain doll. and kind of puts it on this like little shrine in an abandoned warehouse. It's a very creepy doll. It's one of those old-fashioned dolls that has the multiple faces on the head, where you can change it around and give the doll different expressions. So she puts this little doll in her hiding place and lights a votive candle. So again, we're immediately kind of taken into that Catholic space, which we're kind of feeling like Alice has created her own little church environment here. So then, by stealing the doll, Alice lures Karen into this abandoned warehouse, where she famously jumps out from behind a corner and scares Karen. This is the scene that was in Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments, and it is extremely unsettling. Alice, in this scene, pulls off the translucent mask, and underneath the mask is another mask, which is a hag mask, an old woman. With the translucent mask that has the makeup on it, it's already kind of setting this up to be, it's like a grotesque kind of farce of femininity, this mask. And this little girl kind of putting this adult woman's face over her face. It's creating the dichotomy between a grown woman and a young girl, which we will see again and again in this film. And keep in mind, Shepard was 19, and I believe that the casting of her in such a young role was very much on purpose, because she is supposed to be at that threshold of becoming a woman, and that's something that you also is played up in the Holy Terror trailer that we heard in the beginning. So on the day of her first communion, Karen is trying on her veil, and Alice is very jealous, and she's trying the veil on, and Karen completely freaks out at about that, and there's this very interesting shot of Alice in the mirror with the veil, and it's almost like she's grasping at purity and virginity and femininity by playing with Karen's veil. She's unwilling. She doesn't want to grow up. She doesn't want to get past this first communion stage, which, I mean, I'm a Jew, so I don't know a ton about this, but I believe happens when you're 7. So she doesn't want to grow up from the stage. She's kind of in arrested development. So something I found interesting was Catherine, the mother, says to Alice during this tantrum she's having, "You're going to be the prettiest girl there. Wait till Father Tom sees you," which I just kind of wanted to mention. I found that so odd and telling that Father Tom, is kind of, he's a priest, so he's not really supposed to be sexualized, but he is still kind of, he's held up as the ultimate patriarchal figure, which who you're supposed to please with your femininity. There is this antagonistic relationship that's set up between Alice and the landlord, Mr. Alfonso, who's played by Alfonso de Noble, a New Jersey native who was cast after director Sole had seen him impersonating a priest in a local cemetery. So this very creepy antagonistic relationship between those two characters is set up. So right after Catherine says, "Oh, wait till Father Tom sees you," there's a dramatic cut to a woman singing at the church at the communion service, and the first thing she said is, "Lord, my Savior, sanctify my breast." So there are so many allusions here to womanhood being set up already. And then we have the communion scene where Karen is strangled to death in the church transept. And this scene is intercut with children lined up to take communion. And Karen is strangled by a figure in a yellow raincoat and the translucent mask that Alice was wearing earlier. And Alice was also wearing the yellow raincoat earlier. This is, again, harkening back to Don't Look Now, which centers around a little girl in a red raincoat. So it's very much inspired by that film. So Karen is strangled, which is immediately very shocking because we're not used to seeing children, especially little girls, brutalized and murdered in film until much later. So that is still something that is pretty taboo to people, to kill a child in a film. So I just found that really interesting and probably part of why the film faced obscenity charges, because that is such a shocking image. Karen's body is hidden in a church bench, which is then lit on fire with a candle. And before the killer leaves her there, the killer snatches a cross necklace off of her neck. Then we go back to the communion scene of the children taking the communion wafer, and Alice has tried to take communion. She is in a communion veil. She's sort of like snuck in there. And while the other children are sort of kind of like innocently just sticking their tongues out to receive the communion, Alice is grotesquely sort of like widening her mouth and sticking her tongue out and, kind of distorting her face. So she's, the way that she does it is so different than the other children that it has to be intentional on the part of the actress and the director. She's kind of honestly looks like she's about to give a blowjob. So it's very much, again, setting up this idea that Alice is on the threshold of being this sexual being. And of course, communion, you're also on your knees receiving. Catherine, the girl's mother, her sister Annie is there. So there's another duality that's set up here. So there's Catherine and Karen, who are like the perfect, beautiful girl and women in the film. And then there's Alice and Annie, who are like the aberrant kind of women here. So Catherine and Annie sisters are analogous to Alice and Karen. So Annie has a daughter named Angela, who is, it's kind of commented on a few times that she's fat. And she goes to look for Karen because they can't find her, right? Because she's already dead in the bench. Then they cannot find Angela. So Annie goes to look for Angela and a panic breaks out. And as this panic is breaking out, Alice doesn't get to receive communion, and she is begging her mother to be able to receive communion. And she says, "Father wouldn't give me," and then trails off. And there's kind of like this illusion. We don't really understand if she's talking about the priest father, but father is also refers to the absent father. So again, more doubles. So it's a nun who has noticed smoke coming from the transept. She locates Karen's body and screams in horror, disrupting the communion ceremony. At Karen's funeral, there's an interesting scene where Alice and some of the other children are speaking to the landlord, Mr. Alfonso. And Mr. Alfonso is really painted here as a big creep. So he's very fat, which already sets up his otherness. And he's kind of creeping on the kids here and saying that Karen was such a pretty girl and it's too bad that she's the one in the box, kind of implying that Alice should have been the one to be murdered. It is during my rewatch here that I started to think maybe that Mr. Alfonso was being queer coded a little bit as well. He's kind of like mincing with his words, and just the way that he interacts with the kids is very like queer coded. And Alice does this kind of weird thing where she sucks her finger at him, which is very, very sexual. And he says it's always the pretty ones that die. And then he watches the kids leave through this like creepy peephole he has in his apartment. And we also see this shot that kind of comes out of nowhere, which is very shocking, of Karen's kind of mutilated body. We assume it's an autopsy photo, and we kind of assume that this is happening at the police station. Annie moves in for a little bit with her sister Catherine and Alice to kind of take care of her sister and be there for her during this awful time. And Alice and Annie start to clash and fight a lot, and Catherine is the kind of the voice of reason. And again, I sort of think about the theme here of doppelgängers and doubles. And this is something that Keir La-Janice talks about in House of Psychotic Women a lot, which is probably one of my all-time favorite books, and I will reference it a lot on this podcast. She talks about the idea of the doppelganger and how there's this Alice and Karen look quite a bit alike, except maybe Karen is a little prettier because she has fuller lips. That's kind of what the setup is here. And the doppelganger serves in a way to emphasize the inadequacies of the main character. And Alice is really the main character. I mean, the movie is named Alice, Sweet Alice. So Karen, her sister, Brooke Shields, kind of represents for her everything that she's not. And then I think that Annie, her aunt, represents everything that she is. She's the less pretty sister. She's more outspoken, more assertive. And I think that this is why these characters have friction, because they're so much alike, but there also is a lot of self-hate going on there. You always hate yourself the most. And I think that is why these two characters have this friction in the film. So at one point, Alice goes upstairs to Mr. Alfonso to give him the rent check. And Mr. Alfonso is just being kind of generally creepy, like fanning himself listening to opera, which also made me feel like he was being queer coded. But he also tries to assault Alice, and he tries to sexually assault Alice. And it's obviously horrifying. And I think that him being kind of coded as like effeminate is not to literally say that this is a gay man, but I think it's more to, set him up as an aberrant character. When Mr. Alfonso tries to assault Alice, she kills his cat by snapping the cat's neck. So meanwhile, Catherine's ex-husband, Dominic, begins independently investigating the murder. So with the introduction of Dominic, who goes by the name Dom, there's also a doppelganger scenario or theme, motif, whatever you want to call it, set up here between Dom and Father Tom. Obviously, right? Dom, Tom. And they also look kind of alike. So while Detective Spina, who's the name of the detective, is formally handling the case, this is when the family drama between all the women is happening. After the attempted assault by Mr. Alfonso, shortly after, while ascending the steps to go shopping, Annie is attacked by a raincoated figure, again, the yellow raincoat and a mask, a raincoated figure in a mask. At the hospital, Annie claims that Alice tried to kill her. And at the hospital, Catherine reveals that she was pregnant when she got married. So she was already pregnant with Alice before she got married, which in the eyes of the Catholic Church is a sin. And this gets revealed because she says that Annie hates Alice because she is a product of fornication, of sex outside marriage. So that is important. And it also sets up this idea of sin, of tarnished womanhood. So we know Alice is a product of sin, and she's the aberrant sister, right? Karen was conceived in the right way, like in a good Catholic marriage, and Alice was conceived outside of that. And this is part of the reason for her oddness, her odd behavior. But Dom and Catherine believe Alice. They believe that she did not do it. So before Alice is sent to the psychiatric institution, she is questioned by the police, and she's given a lie detector test. And during this scene, the detective giving the lie detector test and Detective Spina are watching her through the glass, and the lie detector detective says, "She's a weird little girl. Did you notice her tits? When I went to put the tube around her, she looked up at me like she wanted me to feel her up." So again, like, remember that they're talking about a 12-year-old girl here. So it's, number one, disgusting. I think it's supposed to be disgusting. I don't think it's supposed to paint these guys in a good light or anything. But I think more importantly, it sets up the idea that Alice, again, is on the threshold of womanhood. She is blossoming and people are noticing. And she has now entered that space that I think as women we all remember, as women and, assigned female at birth people will remember. And actually, I don't even want to go that specific. I think young boys are also highly sexualized, but I think as young boys get older, they start to receive a little bit more respect, whereas as young girls get older, they are seen as fair game. And after this guy says this disgusting thing, Alice, she doesn't hear him, but she knocks over his lie detector machine, which I think is just great. So Alice is pathologized by the psychiatrist at the institution. And the psychiatrist reveals to her mother, when she's meeting with her privately, with her and Dom, that Alice is menstruating already, and she's hid this from her mother. Alice obviously doesn't want to grow up here. And then we kind of see her, this like forlorn shot of her in the quote unquote playground of the psychiatric institution, and she has on these pigtails, and she looks just way too old to be wearing them. This is when I noticed during my rewatch, Alice and Catherine share this long embrace before Catherine leaves her at the psychiatric institution. And there's this shot of them. It's an aerial shot of them in this stairwell. And stairs are such a recurring motif in this film. I believe that the stairs in this film are an allusion to moving through the stages of life. The stages of life as a woman. So starting as an infant and then becoming a beautiful little girl, and then going through this womanhood where you're blossoming, and then ending up as the hag, the bitter hag. Catherine gets a very creepy phone call at home, which is just someone breathing on the other line, and she thinks it's her sister who feels guilty for accusing Alice of attacking her with a knife in the stairwell. And Dom and Catherine have like a little tryst, even though Dom has been remarried. They don't have sex, but they kiss, and then they're interrupted by another phone call. And the phone call is Dom's wife asking him, when he's going to be home. Then Dom is out and about in the world, kind of on this bridge near the house, and he sees a masked figure in a yellow raincoat who leads him into a warehouse. And then there's more stair imagery here. And we can see on the raincoat that it says St. Michael's, which is the name of the school. And the figure stabs Dom and knocks him unconscious. And when Dom comes to, he's tied up. And this figure takes off the mask. And we see that it is Mrs. Tredoni, who you'll recall was scared in the beginning by Alice wearing the mask. So maybe that's where she got the idea. But we see that it is her. She's the killer. So, right, we have the kind of the final incarnation of womanhood here, the hag, right? So we have Karen as the angelic, beautiful, virginal little girl. Then we have Alice as the girl reluctant to enter womanhood, the adolescent girl. Then we have Catherine, the mother, as this kind of angelic mother figure. And then we have Mrs. Tredoni, the final life stage of woman, the crone. Mrs. Tredoni kills Dom pretty brutally. She knocks him in the teeth and with a brick and throws him out the window. Tredoni then goes to confession, and as the father relieves her of her sins, obviously she doesn't say that she murdered someone, she just says she's been sinning. She has this look on her face of like complete orgasmic pleasure. So that will happen again later in the film, that this look that she has. And again, we see that the association between sexuality and Catholicism. During the murder, Mrs. Tredoni chastises Dom and Catherine as sinners over their premarital sex and divorce. So this is her motivation for the killings. It's after Dominic bites Karen's crucifix off her neck. She's wearing Karen's crucifix on her neck. Then Mrs. Tredoni beats him with her shoe and pushes him out a window to his death. During Dom's autopsy, the pathologist finds Karen's crucifix in his mouth, and Alice is formally eliminated as a suspect. After hearing of Dom's death, Catherine goes to visit Father Tom, and he's not home. But Mrs. Tredoni invites Catherine in, and while preparing the night's dinner, which she's preparing a fish, which again, Jesus symbolism, obviously, she explains to Catherine that when her own daughter died on the day of her first communion, she realized children are punished for the sins of their parents. And in her grief and madness, she devoted herself to the church. And it's kind of like there's like a build here of creepy music. And then, she doesn't actually kill Catherine because Father Tom arrives in the midst of the conversation, and he and Catherine leave to get Alice from the institution. So he's kind of standing in for Dom. Later that day, Mrs. Tredoni sneaks into Catherine and Alice's apartment building, unaware that they've left for church. Simultaneously, at the same time, Mr. Alfonso wakes up screaming because we see that Alice has mischievously placed a jar of cockroaches on him while he slept. So Alice has kind of a thing for cockroaches. They were also in her shrine, her doll shrine in the warehouse. And I think that the cockroaches here are kind of an allusion to more aberrant femininity. Insects are also a symbol that have been used a lot in film and art and literature to be associated with female sexuality. While Mr. Alfonso is kind of like screaming and throwing the cockroaches on him, he encounters Mrs. Tredoni in the staircase and mistakes her for Alice and shakes her, and he pushes her against a wall, and while she's against the wall, she stabs him to death and flees. However, Detective Spina witnesses her running out of the back entrance without a mask on. and Mrs. Tredoni rushes to the church where the police are stationed outside. She cuts in line to get communion. So this associates her with Alice, right, in the beginning, where she was shoving her way in line to take communion. And Father Tom denies her communion. And Mrs. Tredoni points at Catherine and screams, but you gave it to that whore. And then violently stabs Father Tom as the police rush in, and Father Tom dies in Mrs. Tredoni's arms while she has this look of orgasmic pleasure on her face as the blood rushes out of him. Alice, there's a shot of her walking somberly, kind of like a bride, down the aisle, but in reverse, because she's walking away from the aisle. She's walking away from faith. And she has Mrs. Tredoni's shopping bag, and she places the blood-stained butcher knife into it. So it kind of leaves it on a cliffhanger there. You know, is she gonna go on and be this killer, right? So it kind of maybe even sets it up for a sequel, which never happened. That is the plot of Alice, Sweet Alice. Again, just to kind of recap here, the overarching theme here in the film seems to be the passage of a girl through the stages of womanhood, culminating sort of in the murderous hag here. Femininity there's a lot of duality, a lot of dichotomies that's set up between the good, the pretty girls and the weird, ugly girls. Mrs. Tredoni, I notice, does not have a counterpart. Mrs. Tredoni is an old woman with gray hair and an Italian accent. So again, she's the killer. So Alice kind of ripping off that translucent mask in the beginning to reveal her hag face was kind of almost like a setup for Mrs. Tredoni being the killer. And a lot of doppelganger themes, the characters, a lot of them look very similar. So Alice and Karen look like almost identical. Catherine and Annie look very similar, but there's always just like a slight thing, like Alice is just a little bit more, how do you even say it? Because it's so subjective. She's a little weirder looking, and just like there's something off. And Catherine and Annie, Annie is just not as pretty as Catherine. There's just like something off there. Dom and Tom are like the patriarchal figures, and they both die. So they're both killed by Mrs. Tredoni. So the patriarch here is murdered, which, you know, honestly, considering Alfred Sole's sentiments against the Catholic Church, is probably a larger symbol for the Catholic Church, which is a very patriarchal institution. So this has been the first episode of Girls, Guts, and Giallo. I hope you enjoyed. Give me a follow on Instagram at Girls, Guts, and Giallo. You can also follow my personal account at FatGawth, FATGAWTH. Typically, I will be recapping or, you know, discussing themes in films on my own just because of scheduling issues. But I do have a really great lineup of guests. That is definitely coming. It won't always be just me here. I'll change up the format a little bit. I'm just going to do whatever works for me with timing and production. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week on Girls, Guts, and Giallo. As we leave here, I'm going to play you some music from Alice, Sweet Alice.